Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back. It's Friday. Yay, my favorite day of the week. Not just because it's the end of the week, actually. I love it for a whole host of reasons. Specifically, I love doing this. I love it. Although so much so that I'm even considering doing more. So if you are new here or you're catching the replay, hello, I am Tigria Gardenia. I am a nature-inspired mentor and a certified life coach. And I'm also, which is the part that's a little bit more interesting for what we're doing today, a world ambassador of plant advocacy. I've changed that title a few times in the past. I had as a world ambassador for plant intelligence, world ambassador for plant consciousness. And after having a big debate with people inside of my community, we kind of decided that it would be better to go with plant advocacy because it feels more complete, especially given what we're doing today. So I'm really excited to have you here and to be kind of, I don't know. There's so much to talk about. Let me say this. Today, I was organizing all of the papers that I want to review for you. So if you're new here, every Friday or whatever, anytime that you see me online, I review papers around plant intelligence, plant consciousness, um, critical plant studies, plant humanities. Oh, the list goes on and on. Basically, all kinds of plant-related subjects. I don't go that much into the more technical papers around plant physiology, plant biology, botany, and those types of things. Not only because I feel like for our discussions, I try to pick the ones that make the most amount of sense. What I'm looking to do is helping you really understand what it is that's being talked about. But more than anything, also some of these papers, like the ones that we've done in the last few weeks around plant performance and vegetalized performance, and how exactly plants enter into the mainstream are really opening completely new discussions around the idea of plants as persons, plants and consciousness, as well as plants and humans and the interaction between plants and humans. So the whole kind of concept of plant anthropology. So I try to pick the papers that are going to really induce a new type of conversation, that are going to open us to kind of the vegetal world in new ways, and that are going to allow us to really just have a bigger conversation, have a more expansive conversation. I'm trying to fix my screen here so that I see myself, see everything in a way that is as clear as possible. I keep playing with my setup. And the other part about this that's really that's really excited is that we want to continue this conversation on. So through the comments here, so wherever you're watching, whenever you're watching, the comments here are a really great place for us to get into what's going on. So please, I want you to comment. I want to be able to interact in that way, but also we have the conversation going in the naturally conscious community. So if you've never heard of it, the naturally conscious community is an ecosystem, an online ecosystem that I founded specifically for us to have this conversation. What does it look like when humans and plants are co-creating and coexisting and not coexisting? We just talked about coexistence yesterday in one of our calls, but really more about co-creating, right? So what does it look like? What are the conversations we need to have in order for that to happen? And also, how do we have to change in order to make more space for plants as partners, as mentors, as models, as co-conspirators in some ways, which is what I find that they are. So the naturally conscious community really is the place to have those types of conversations. And I'm really excited when we have the opportunity to kind of open the floor to that. Today we were talking in there about art and like vegetalized art, and how the vegetal moves into the art to express new levels of depth in a beautiful painting that I found and I shared with everybody. But there's lots of other kinds of discussions. We also have a writing group and a book club and courses and just lots of different things that are happening. So the naturally conscious community is really the place if you're interested in these subjects and if you're looking for more conversation about these types of subjects and you want a place where you can share your ideas and your thoughts and meet other people that are interested in bringing all of this plant connection into everyday life, then that's your place. That's the place that you want to go. So I'm really excited about that. And of course, I'm also on all the other social medias as well, Instagram and Facebook and such. But that's the place, the naturally conscious community really is the place more where I hang out, where I follow up on these discussions and where we go in depth on them, both on calls. We have a whole calendar of things that happened every single month as well. So, but today we are here to talk about the vegetative city. I told you today I was reorganizing all of our papers. I have at least another 50 in the queue. No, that's crazy. I haven't even gone through all of the ones that I want to. I collect from emails that people send me, from different publications that I'm on. I'm always on the hunt for any of these types of papers. And as soon as they arrive, I squirrel them away, and then I try once a month to grab all of those and then organize them. But there's so many that are coming through. So we've got lots to talk about, lots and lots and lots to talk about. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about the vegetative city. And so the vegetative city, let me share this paper with you. Here we go. So this is a paper that came out in 2018. As you know, I have to try to organize them right now. I could organize them by themes, and in some cases I have. For example, when we were having the discussion on plant consciousness, I tried to go by theme. So I grabbed as many of the papers as I could find around plant consciousness. To be honest, I have to do that again because since we have completed the first round, which all of them are in both the naturally conscious community. So of course you can find them there. If you go into Sprout Central, Sprout Discussions, you will see programs and replays. And in there are all of the papers that we've gone through. Most of them have also been published on my blog, on my website. So just /blog on my website. And most of them, I'm getting them little by little, the older ones back up onto YouTube. It's just taking me a while because there's a lot of them, to be honest. So the full set, so that you can actually see it also in running order, so how we address them, are all inside of the naturally conscious community. And then little by little, I'll get the rest of them up in the other places. So that was a big conversation that I had around plant consciousness, and we grabbed all the papers through to the time that we were going. Since then, there have been a few more that are around it. The conversation has somewhat morphed a little bit. We've moved from the strict kind of plant consciousness conversation, although there is some, but it adds in the elements of plant cognition and also the plants as persons. And the plants as person one, which I love, it's a great conversation to have, but it gets hairy because it starts to move into the conversation around plant rights. And the reason why plant rights is a little bit tricky is because there is the entire nature rights discussion as well as the rights of plants discussion. And they sound like they should be the same thing, but they kind of are slightly different. And the reason that it's different is because many of the rights of nature are using as models persons like rivers or entire forest areas, which is obviously super interesting. And I'm glad that these conversations are happening and that in some cases these rights are being declared. When you talk about plants, the situation gets even trickier because when you're talking about a river, it's easier, because it's not always easy, to differentiate that we're talking about this river. And when which is just kind of crazy to me that we could grant rights to one river and not grant it to all rivers. I still haven't understood how exactly that works in somebody's mind, but somebody thinks that that's okay. It just seems like once you acknowledge that a river should have rights, all rivers should have rights. Once you acknowledge that a mountain should have rights, all mountains should have rights. Once you know what I'm saying? Like, it seems weird. But when you get to plants, it gets even more complex because we run into the situation of what is an individual. And this is, similar to when we talk about anything from bacteria to fungi as well, but specifically around the plant conversation. How do we identify the individual, the person that we're specifically talking with? Even if you look around and you look around your house and you look at the houseplants that live with you, even when you're looking at houseplants, it comes a point where you could separate those houseplants. And so therefore, are each one of these an individual? And if so, then how do the rights apply? So there have been some really interesting discussions on this. So I'm hoping to also do some commentary on some of the panel discussions that I've watched. It's just, it's just finding the time. There's so many good things to talk about. So here we are today. And today we're actually going to be talking about, again, the vegetative city. And I found this really interesting because it straddles the idea of culture and theory in architecture and city development, which is a topic that's really important to me. I really feel that our urban spaces there's lots and lots and lots of conversation around the urban spaces and the importance of the urban space. I also would add on top of that I feel like it's really important to recognize that our cities are built not just badly from the perspective of heat island effect and from noise and pollution and from, birds dying because they're hitting the corridor. I mean, they're hitting buildings that are reflective, but also, and that they're isolating of people, but also the fact that they isolate humans from nature and from humans from all different kinds of beings of nature, from the city ant to all of the plants. So there's just a lot of conversation. So this was one that kind of caught my attention. Like I said, it was published in 2018, excuse me, not 8. So, hold on. I'm trying to, there we go. Okay, so this is called The Vegetative City by Andrea Mubi. For whatever reason, hold on a second. My window, there we go. My window was extremely small compared to what I want. So I find this interesting. Andrea Mubi Brighenti. So this is the University of Trento in Trento, Italy, which is actually not that far from where I live, which is kind of funny. I never look at that beforehand, so I always find it interesting. I forget that there is actually a lot of stuff going on in Italy, to be honest, even though I live here. Okay, so let's jump in. Let's look at what Andrea has to say. Andrea's abstract is: the vegetative stratum is a layer of existence that is inherent not only in plants. Oops, hold on. Sorry. Let me hold on. Okay, getting things around, getting things done. Okay, the vegetative stratum is a layer of existence that is inherent not only in plants. Here, I propose to look at how vegetative life, or the vegetative mode of existence, affects cities. The vegetative mode of existence is not focused on activities, routines, achievements. Here appears a city that is not industrial or industrious. While the industrious city retreats or falls apart, the vegetative stratum becomes visible. The vegetative city is a city without any central nervous system. I suggest the interpretation of the vegetative city as a hopeful manifestation of the urban that only takes place when the time is right. So in this case, it sounds like from this abstract, what we're looking to do is to look at plant as model, as model and mentor in some ways, right? Mostly model is to see how that happens. Now, there is a lot of interesting conversation happening recently around what it means to be vegetal, to be vegetative. Vegetative, if you really think about it, has historically been something that we've thought about kind of with a negative context, right? We think of the vegetative state as a state of nothingness, of non-movement, of just kind of beingness, with a negative slant, right? Almost lazy. But now there seems to be this sort of shift that's happening that I find super interesting around the perspective that the vegetative stratum, right? I'm not even going to use that word. Let me go back a second. The whole idea of vegetative or vegetative is actually really quite positive. It's the idea of beingness, the idea of presence, the idea of I am in the present moment. And so I'm curious as to whether or not Andrea is going to go into it in that perspective, because it sounds like from what he's saying, and I'm assuming it's a he because being Italian, Andrea is actually a male name, but if you're a they, I apologize sincerely. super sincerely. The vegetative mode of existence is not focused on activities, routines, and achievements, right? It's talking about that stratum of this of city life that's not all about the hustle and bustle, but the more of the beingness, of the being part of the city, of the being in the city and of the city. So I'm super curious as to whether or not this is going to be part of the discussion that we're going to be having. All right. For the rest of time, life makes its course. Gilles Clement. I want, and actually, we have talked about this paper. I want to check really quick one thing because we have a few different places where I just realized that I published to, and I wanted to make sure that we're actually live. I'm still not that great at starting off and making sure that everything is playing in the correct places. So bear with me while I do this for a second. The beauties of doing things live is that you're never really sure. All right, so here we are. All right. I'm just kind of making a note on one of the other platforms so that people can, tune in. All right. I don't know why my keyboard is being weird. Okay. Okay. All right, that being said, okay, we're ready. We're back. This paper stems from an attempt to think about cities through the prism of plant life. It seeks to develop the non-reductionist view that does not fall into the trap of saying that the city is like a plant. Just as in the past, it was claimed by urbanist theorists and philosophers that the city is like an organism or like a machine. Okay, so if it's not like, now I'm even more curious. If one risk of this exploration lies then in conflating the two terms, the opposite risk lies in dichotomizing them. Necessarily, the paper moves along a thin line where reinstating the nostalgic dichotomy of nature versus culture is always present. Taking inspiration from the Deleuze and Guattari, one that we've cited a lot in recent papers, all dualisms are false, even though the evolution of thought is often somehow forced to transit through them. On what terrain can the city and the plant meet in a way that some fruitful insights into the nature of both can come to light without forcing categories and ideologies upon independent processes? How to prepare the soil for such a meeting? The paper does not present any conclusive argument. It contents itself with undertaking the opening up of the field in a way possible to encounter phenomenon that, while admittedly different, might prove to enter a resonant phrase. Consequently, the plant-city relation explored here is neither analogic nor isomorphic. Rather, it pivots around a number of points of resonance. These may also be called inconclusive elective affinities that have their qualitative moments of happening. Interesting. I like the fact that I really do have to say that I like the fact that there is no. Whoa, sorry, my mouse is acting weird. There is not this need to specifically end up in a conclusion. And this is, again, going back, this is the reason why the naturally conscious community exists, is to have these types of conversations. And I'm glad that they're saying that this isn't conclusive, because honestly, many of these conversations are just in their infancy. They're in their infancy. We're just starting to have them. We don't have conclusions. We still haven't even most of the time brought the plants into the discussion. It's still a discussion between a small segmented group of people. And so if we're going to have these discussions in a broader context, we need that time. We need the time to marinate around them. We need the time to think about them, process them, look at them from different points of view. And so therefore, it's extremely important for us to not to jump to conclusions. So many of these papers that try to say this is how it is are kind of almost missing the mark of where we are. And this is great that they're not jumping there. Vegetation entertains a special and complex relation to the city, beginning from the fact that plants are an essential component of the urban ecology. However, what specifically interests us here is not so much vegetation per se, biologically understood, nor even plants as part of the hybrid composition of urban space, ecologically or post-humanly understood. Rather, I would like to focus on what I propose to call the vegetative stratum. The vegetative stratum is a layer of existence that is inherent not only in plants, but also animals and possibly also other biological kingdoms. All right, already this person has me hooked because they're talking about other biological kingdoms. Like, so far, so good. It encompasses the functions of vegetation and the states associated with it. In the following, I propose to approach vegetation as a stratum or layer in order to allow for the coexistence of it with other strata, mineral, animal, fungi, bacteria, so forth, possibly in reciprocal interaction. Advancing this view, I suggest it is possible to apply the notion of vegetative stratum to city where sections on various scales, and even the city as a whole, to apprehend urban life from a novel perspective. The city also vegetates. This, in short, is the hypothesis I submit. If urban space possesses a vegetative stratum, a series of heuristic working questions ensue, such as how to capture and describe it. With our limited language, I might add. Our limited language, no matter what language you speak, it's just our language hasn't developed it. How could recognition of the vegetative stratum change our conception on what is urban and what is not? What are the consequences of observing and exploring the city through the vegetative stratum? All good questions, all good questions. And I've got just a place where you can have these conversations. I'm just going to leave this here while we're talking for a second because I think it's going to be useful. Despite the fact that we incessantly experience the vegetative form of existence in our life, whatever we do, we also vegetate. Yes, our inner plantness coming through. The latter proves elusive to the analytical mind. Animals have their vegetation, yet it is difficult to express in words what constitutes the proprium of such state. Interestingly, the converse may also happen. Plants may contain or express a certain animation, especially as it occurs in peculiar, qualitatively distinct animistic moments. If animals, among other things, vegetate, and plants at times also animate, then it is only through a series of tentative approximations that one can approach the intermediate milieu. Ooh, hold on a second. We have footnotes. You know, I love them. Let's go back. Interesting, the converse may also happen. Plants may contain or express a certain animation, especially as it occurs in peculiar, qualitatively distinctive animistic movements. First footnote. Some plants, such as Desmodium motorium, also known to perform spontaneous visible movements. Yet, animation may also be said to come about in different guises than just, more or less, mechanical movement. I suggest that plants may animate even when they do not mimic animal behavior. And this is a good suggestion. This is a very good suggestion because plants animate in a whole number of different ways that we are discovering more and more every day. The movement is different oftentimes from what we assume as from an animalistic perspective. Not just that it's slower, but it literally is different. And so it's understandable that we don't always recognize this. All right, let's go for that second. If animals, among other things, vegetate and plants at times also animate, then it is only through a series of tentative approximations that one can approach the intermediate milieu where the vegetative stratum is located. Let's go with the second one. With apologies for redundancy, admittedly, the milieu is intermediate by definition. Yes, agreed. In his vegetal philosophy, for instance, Michael Martyr has importantly pointed out the ambivalence intrinsic to the common understandings of vegetation. On the one hand, vegetal being has long been regarded as a diminished state of life, to the point that doubts were recurrently raised by philosophers about the inclusion of plants among the living entity. Doubts which were only formally dispelled by 19th century biology with the discovery of plant metabolism. Ah, Aristotle. We always get there. We always end up in Aristotle talking about plant life being on the low totem pole. On the other hand, and etymologically, to vegetate means to blossom and flourish. Really? I didn't know that. Hmm. And observers were always awed by how, contrary to animals, plants may continue to grow and develop until the very term of their existence. Footnote 3. The Latin verb vegeto is both intransitive and transitive, whereas the intransitive form means being alive. The transitive form conveys the sense of animating, reinvigorating, strengthening, and fortifying. A common phrase in modern day Italian, vivo e vegeto, meaning that someone is alive and kicking, directly traces from the original Latin verb. By contrast, in the youngsters' slang, one can find expressions such as ma sei un vegetale to tease a lazy, inert person. Needless to say, I don't use that expression in Italian. I've never even used vivo e vegeto. To be honest, I've never actually heard anybody here use it. Might be one of those old. I'm gonna ask. I'm gonna ask around and see. Vivo e vegeto, because I like it if that's what it means: animating, reinvigorating, strengthening, alive and kicking. But ma sei un vegetale? Let's not use that. So the vegetative state has been simultaneously and to some extent contradictorily seen as, on the one hand, luxuriant, chaotic, deregulated, and excessively vital, as well as, on the other, mute, numb, inert, and lacking vitality. Yeek. What is more poignant is that our theoretical understanding of the status of plants is not only scientific, but also inevitably moral and political. Using the scheme of the plant as a model for society has been a recurrent idea in Western discourse. Using the scheme of the plant as a model for society. See, this is personal opinion right now for 1 second, okay? Because being somebody who is Italian as well, in the sense that I live in Italy and I'm an Italian citizen, when he says using the scheme of the plant as a model, this is my opinion. I know that he's using the word scheme technically correctly, but scheme in Italian is a word for a pattern, and it's like a schema. And so it feels like that's where he's like, yeah, it's a weird word to insert there. Sorry. I know it's an aside. It's an aside that kind of trips me up because we use it here a lot for different things. For instance, as documented by Nicoli, the image of the tree features abundantly in 16th and 17th century German world, recalling both social unity and stratification. Incidentally, the social political image of the tree in Central Northern Europe resonates with Canetti's claim that the mass symbol of germination. Sorry, I don't really like this view. I want to see, not that view. I want to see this view. This works. Okay. Incidentally, the social political image of the tree in Central Northern Europe resonates with Canetti's claim that the mass symbol of a German nation is the forest. The Germans, as the continental people, the landed people, look at trees as symbols of their own rootedness. Ooh, footnote. I like footnotes. In The Golden Bough, James Fraser recalls the ancient worship of trees in Northern Europe, where trees were conceived as of tree spirits in connection to weather, rains, and fertility, pregnancies. In this respect, the May tree tradition is particularly striking. In spring or early summer, or even on Midsummer Day, it was and still is in many parts of Europe the custom to go out into the woods, cut down a tree, and bring it into the village where it is set up amid general rejoicing, where the people cut branches in the woods and fasten them onto every house. I would even argue that there's an older tradition that's not being accounted for here, which is the fact that when we look at the way different peoples divided up around the world, I'm not even going to touch on Atlantean myth, which I can get into in a second to kind of give a face to this, but I'm going to give you a different face to it, which is the fact that we saw from the peoples of the world, we saw sort of like, if you look at Egyptian culture, for example, with its ornate temples, the idea that the divine is something that you build a house for, you build a very ornate structure. It's kind of like the whole church concept, right? I worship in an area and I build this beauty in order to show my worship for and to in, entice or and symbolize the divine. There's an entire other side of the culture that went through things like, for example, passing through the Nordic cultures, coming into the Celtic cultures, that instead looked for the divine is as an expression in nature. So nature was the expression of that divine. So of course, if you have nature as an expression of the divine, and therefore I go into nature to be with nature, to be a part of nature and to remind myself that I am nature. It's two different approaches that both worship divineness, right? One that comes through and obviously takes roots across Europe in many different ways. Hence why we see this whole concept of, like we were just talking about the Germanic people, and looking at it from the perspective of existence, that, worship of trees and the worship of the forest as a place to go and commune with the divine. So this makes perfect sense of it. And that was really what cities were built for. Like towns were built with the idea of the woods nearby, because that was the place of worship. That was the place of being in communion with. Not by chance, then, a more or less subterranean, nostalgic vision of the Silvo-agrarian society seems to run through modern German philosophy, from at least Ferdinand Tönnies to Martin Heidegger. The latter's famous retreat hut in Totnaburg in the southern Black Forest Mountains, for instance, grounds the ideals of a return to authentic, Bauer-like, off-grid living that also comes with a traditional family model and a whole world view. Let's go see what this world view is. Of course, this does not mean that the whole of Heidegger's philosophy is to be reduced to sheer urbanophobia. And anyways, we're not talking about urbanophobia. Again, we're talking about place of worship. Nonetheless, Todd life provides an interesting entry point into the philosopher's work, and its importance can hardly be diminished, given that most of his works were written there. For a rich documentation on Heidegger's hut, see Schar, an unforgettable literary rendition of Heidegger at Todd was provided by Thomas Bernhard in his novel Old Masters. Before Heidegger, in the early generation of German sociologists, it had already been determined by Tönnies that whereas community is premised upon land, property, and family organization and embodiments of the natural law, society is founded upon the notion of juridical persons, the institution of money and ensuing contractual obligations. However, Tönnies also held that there must be natural law of society as well, thereby suggesting that social order always needs a compromise between will and custom. I wonder, it's interesting to see why this was put in here. Like, what was it that was driving the author Andrea to post this in exactly this place? Because I mean, it makes sense to me based on the knowledge that I understand from around what natural law, again, going back to what I was saying, from the Nordic cultures coming in to the Celtic cultures coming through across to Europe. These are all the idea that natural law is my connection to the divine, but it's also my connection with place, my connection with people, and therefore my society develops from there. Society, the idea, is founded upon notions of juridical persons, which is true, but even in Celtic cultures and ancient Celtic cultures, from my understanding, and please, if you are an expert, please feel free to let me know more details on this. I am but a novice, just trying to understand, is that, that mixing between natural law and society was much more integrated. There was much more of an integration between these 2 points. So interesting that he decided to put that part of the footnote in there. Okay, where were we? Back 5. Being territorialized in this way sets out a neat contrast with urban life, which, as argued by Deleuze and Guattari, means with a movement of territorialization, big words, of detachment from the land. From the Silvo-agrarian thinking, plants stand as a model of natural life that modernity has lost. Sometimes, even progressive contemporary authors seem to fall prey to some forms of Silvo-Agrarian nostalgia. Let's go back and see who. Take, for instance, the case of Martyr. Hold on, I want to make this a little bit bigger. Let's make it bigger. Oh, that's not good because then that has me. Let me move. Can I move me? Thought I could move me. Oh, no, I can't move me. All right, I lied. Let's go back to here. Take for instance, the case of Martyr. It might sound as groundless, provocation, and unsubstantiated to claim to take Martyr as a supporter of an agrarian version of society. However, following his autobiographic remarks about how he became interested in plants, one reads a story of a boy who grew up in many different locations in Russia, Israel, and the US, and for whom plants came to represent an ideal of rootedness, consistency, and fidelity to the land. Cosmopolitanism and Silvo-Agrarian nostalgia can be intertwined. Here, the point is clearly not to criticize Martyr, whose exceptional scholarship is of undoubted value, rather to ponder how probably even theorists has his or her agrarian moment. I do not contemn this sympathy per se, but highlight that it is just one of the possible ways in which plants can be approached. Interesting that he felt the need to say that, almost as if, I don't know. I'm really curious as to whether or not you see the idea of this Silvo-Agrarian lifestyle, right, to be considered the antithesis to urbanality, I guess. I guess it is because it is rural and because it does, again, as I was talking about, bring the relationship to plants into a daily contact that is just very, very different from how we are experiencing it today. I don't know. This is really curious. I'm super curious when we keep going as to whether or not, I don't know. Of course, our nostalgia is the mourning for the loss of something that was never there in the first place, but that is not what matters most. The consequence of looking at plants nostalgically is that cities are presented as anti-nature. Okay, now I get why he's introducing it. This makes more sense. More contextually, in many of the pro-plant, pro-Silvo-Agrarian authors, this substantially means that urban rhythms are regarded as different, equals wrong, from the rhythms of agrarian societies, equals right. As expected, this view turns into the complaint that modern life lacks patience, commitment, and fidelity that characterize the peasant's relation to vegetal cycles of existence, that urban rhythms are chaotic, unhealthy, obnoxious, etc. In other words, the tropes of classic urban phobia resurface. Okay, now I get why he inserted this. So he inserted this because he's trying to show the two different extremes. Although, as he made in his note for Martyr, I do not believe that this is saying what's right and what is wrong by its very nature. I continue to argue, and I would love to have this discussion at a deeper level, and I've had it on multiple levels with architects and with, biomimics and in all the work that I've done, is that we are designing our cities wrong. Our cities are designed for chaos and for, I don't know if I'd say unhealthy, obnoxious, but they are designed by quote unquote nature for speed, for lots of movement, for different perspectives. So hold on, folks. I'm going to check what's going on here on the connection stream because I'm getting kind of a little note that says that my connection is unstable and I'm not exactly sure why. So I am going to, that might be a reason why. Okay, hopefully I'm trying, I'm trying to figure out why it's telling me it's unstable. So I apologize if you're seeing it in an unstable way. Yeah, this is always the problem with a live stream. Things have just been a little bit chaotic here recently. There's a lot of changes that are going on in this area relating to how internet is coming in. And even where I live right now, we're moving over to fiber, and I'm afraid All right. I don't know if that made it better or not. Did it? If you did, please send me a comment. Let me know what you're seeing and let me know if it's better or if it's worse. It might just be all the same and that it would be better for me to stay connected to the other one, but we will find out. I'll keep monitoring it and we'll see. All right, let's keep going. Oops. Let's go over here. Besides the fact that the opposition between urban and natural does not hold because cities have their nature too, this is not the line of thought that this paper suggests to take. The unfolding of two interrelated yet distinct phenomena should be considered, namely the life of plants in cities and the vegetative life of cities. Yeah, definitely two things. My hypothesis is that a study of the vegetative stratum may reveal something about the untamed and unpredictable nature of cities, but also remind us that the mute, numb, non-historical nature of cities is no less precious, no less vital than its organizational, eventual, and historic nature. Go back here. I must credit an anonymous review for reminding someone that the ambivalence of vegetation must be recognized here too. Fair? Where am I? If a plant growth and the vegetative stratum challenge the infrastructural, legal, governmental, and architectural order of the built environment, iconically illustrated by plant roots piercing the asphalt, moving bricks, breaking into sewage, and slowly but irresistibly covering buildings and infrastructures, then the relations between regulations, policies, rhythms, and growth becomes a sensible area of inquiry. It is perhaps not too difficult to imagine a certain vandalism of plants connected to their relentless vitality, dyed in intractableness. Vegetative states also seem capable of putting us in communication with a great sense of common relief, sometimes even acquiescence. How to explain such duplicity? Albert Carnus, in his late work, employed by the beautiful and mysterious expression consentement à la terre, meaning an acceptance of the earth, which does not rule out humanism and the state of rebelliousness which Camus famously attached to the human condition. Okay, I have a question for you all, because I have to admit, I am struggling with reading this. I feel, how do I say this? I feel like he is, look, I am the first one to admit to all of you, and I admit this all the time, right, that a lot of these concepts are very difficult, right? In this particular case, it sounds like he's trying to weigh between the two, the idea of vegetation in city, right, relationship to vegetation, and this vegetative stratum, which from what I am inferring, and maybe probably based on my own definitions, and so that's why I want you to help me out. Like, let me know what you're thinking about this, is that the vegetative stratum, in the way that he's talking about it, is the more present, more, I don't want to say calm, but I want to say aware. Yeah, like it is calm. I mean, he seems to be bouncing between these two pieces. The problem is that his argument is that he's constantly bouncing. I feel like it's confused. I feel like there's a few different things that are happening. As a person who reads a lot of these papers, and I mean, I share a lot of the ones that I read with you. So we've gone through so many of these together. There is a part of it that feels like he's almost speaking to an audience that he thinks is going to be arguing with him all of these points. So he is very much choosing words carefully and bouncing between things. And it doesn't feel like he's giving himself the space for a coherent thought on one of these different pieces. And this is really frustrating and hard to read, because it's like, I don't understand if the point is to talk about the vegetative stratum, if the point is to talk about the vegetative stratum in the perspective of the vegetative stratum is this piece that affects all of us, humans, plants, animals, infrastructure, everything alike, right? It has this vegetative state, which makes sense to me, right? Because we talk about inner plantness all the time and we talk about the plantness of all. And so I can get this argument. And then on the other side, there is the, well, but don't confuse it with the idea of I'm talking about more plants in the city. And I'm talking about the fact that we need to design in a different way. So I feel like he's trying to kind of not go into this argument, which makes sense. And he's trying to talk about this thing over here about this vegetative stratum. But I don't know about you, but what I'm feeling is he's not allowing himself to go into that conversation because he's too busy trying to state that he's not trying to badmouth urbanization. And I don't think that these two things are much like, I don't think that if you talk about the vegetative stratum, and I don't think that if you discuss the idea of the importance of a vegetative state and a vegetative mode of being and the ability for a city or for an urban space to promote a vegetative state of being, I don't feel like that's a saying that all speed and chaos and movement is bad. Like, I just feel, and this might be because I live in Italy, it feels like an Italian argument of like, well, these two things have to be pitted against each other. I don't see them as pitted against each other. What we're saying, though, is that right now, we don't always value or allow ourselves to be in this part over here, which is this vegetative state, because we get too easily caught up in this other chaotic movement-based action, activity, animalistic kind of state over here. That doesn't mean that we don't need the animalistic kind of state. Obviously, this state over here is important, right? The state is something that we want. The state is something that we look for in cities. That's the reason why we want to live in cities. And at the same time, we also need more of this vegetative stratum, this vegetative state to come out to create a vegetative city that allows both of these parts. It's what I'm always talking about relating to ourselves. I am a human being. That means I am an animal, but I also have a plantness inside of me that allows me to express or that enhances my expression of my presence, of my awareness of who I am. And it just feels like he's going through this, writing this, and he's almost already defending himself too much. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it because that's just how I'm reading into it. And it's making it hard to read. And that's really quite frustrating. On growth and sentience, on we go, and let's see if we can like parse some of this stuff out. The notion of vegetativeness or vegetative stratum may help to review the notion of not only plants, but also animals and minerals, as well as their possible association, the space of their unfolding encounter. While, as said, the vegetative stratum is not specifically located in plants alone, observing plants retains a powerful revelatory potential. As a caveat, however, it should be specified that what is going to be predicated of plants, animals, and minerals should more precisely attributed to the vegetal, animal, and mineral layers of existence, to the vegetation, animation, and mineralization as analytical keys to cut through the actual phenomenon. The phenomena to be observed are compound of different types of life or modes of existence. They may appear in a plurality of loci and intermingle in an exponential number of ways, which this again makes sense to me. It's what I keep saying. And that's why we do have an animal state, an animal way of being. We have a mineral sort of a way of being. We have a fungi way of being and a bacteria way of being. All of these are parts of who we are. And so what we're trying to do is to, it sounds like what he's trying to do is express these different stratum in a city. Does the city permit you to express these different pieces? Again, without holding one down, but allows all of them to come up in different aspects based on when it is most appropriate. And in some cases, for them to intermingle in the sense that I can be one and the other simultaneously. So I don't know if it's the language thing, if it's because maybe English is not the primary language, because there's an academic layer of language mixed on top of that. Maybe this was a translation. I find that oftentimes the translation process is, as a person who does a lot of translation from Italian to English, it's way slower than you think it needs to be because there's a lot of pondering to figure it out. Or sometimes some of this work is done in English, but when it's done in English in an Italian setting, you sort of settle into a a vocabulary, into a way of speaking that may not be what other English speakers experience. So that could be also playing into it a little bit. Hopefully, I think now that he's kind of gotten his feet wet, maybe now we're going to see a little bit more. The life of plants highlights how the vegetative stratum is topologically distributed, flat, non-hierarchical. While the plant can certainly be studied biologically as a series of interconnected functions, and much of current biology focuses precisely on the genetic underpinning of such functional architecture, the phenomenology of vegetativeness also reveals a global non-functional dimension of plant life. That the plant does not subject its parts to a strict organizational diagram, and especially it does not sacrifice those parts for the benefit of higher organizational requirements. The plant does not subject its parts to strict organizational diagram. Is that actually true? Let's keep going and see, because I don't know. That one, lack of functions that interrelate the parts inside the whole organism, lack of hierarchy that subjects the parts to a single functional scheme for the organism. That is what vegetable life presents us with. Again, this statement must be read as, this is footnote 9, as a matter of degrees when referred to actual plants, and as a matter of kind when referred to the vegetative stratum, excuse me. I'm not even sure from a biological perspective that's 100% correct. It just feels contrived. It feels contrived. That's what it is. I feel like, and look, we talk about a lot of these types of subjects matters, but this feels, I don't know, it feels contrived. It feels uneasy. But whereas the animal possesses specific sense organs, every plant cell is sensible. In other words, vegetal sensitivity is more distributed and open than animal sensitivity. Here's the thing I'm not understanding. I just realized that what I'm not understanding. I am not able to follow when he goes from, so let me back up to maybe explain this. When I started to study biomimicry for social innovation, right? So looking at biomimetic principles and how different organisms in the natural world do things and apply it to social situations, one of the most important lessons that was taught from the very beginning is the fact that obviously when you're looking at the design of a project or of a product more than anything, right? If I'm looking at biomimicry for design when it comes to a product, I can look specifically at the mechanisms that any organism uses. For example, I need to move water down a tube. I can look at all the different ways, or I need to move something through a tube. I can look at all the different organisms that have a tube-like structure and that they have to move something to, whether you're talking about blood through your veins, or whether you're talking about the esophagus and the way that that pushes, or whether you're talking about a lymph system, the lymph system of a plant. All of these are tube-like structures that then have to move liquids. And so therefore I can take a snapshot of how that works, and then I can apply those principles directly into whatever it is that I'm designing. When instead I'm talking about biomimicry for social innovation, so I'm looking at how a group moves something. So I have a piece of information that I need to move. I'm looking at a communication system designed from a biomimetic perspective. I have to look at how do, maybe for communication purposes, how do different organisms move things? But I have to look at it much less about the specific biological response, but more of the model, right? The overarching model that applies to something. So for example, I was designing as a project once the idea of a system for after a hurricane, where hurricane with mass destruction in a wide area, if an organization was to come in and create a very quick hub that got that ensured that the educational system in that location didn't go down, even though there was no infrastructure, because the hurricane had wiped out all current infrastructure. So therefore schools were unusable and teachers were displaced, and who knows what they were working on and all kinds of different things. The idea was that this project could come in and design very quickly, set up a system that allowed for education models to continue to move forward, because in certain countries, if, for example, girls are taken out of an education system, they kind of fall backwards and become like, because there's an emergency happening, they come back into the house. They might not ever come out of the house again, right? So because these are just societies that have this cultural bound of what a girl should be doing, or what a feminine should be doing. So therefore, we were looking at what kinds of models, and we looked at something like the educational models of beavers. We looked at the pioneering species of trees, like for example, a pine tree. And what is it that the pine tree does? The pine tree grows very quickly certain aspects to provide shelter, to provide physical space for things that happen underneath, right? Creating shade. And therefore, so am I looking at how the leaves grow? No, I am. When it comes to the beaver, am I looking at specifically how the things that the beaver teaches, the beaver, I can't remember what they're called. I don't remember if they're called cubs or not. Anyways, the young beavers, we're not looking at that. What we're looking at is the model. The beaver uses an educational system that for about 2 years, the beaver mother keeps the young one nearby and teaches as they go about their day. So almost kind of like an apprenticeship model. And the pioneer tree creates shade, creates place, creates a space where the land below it can be nourished. So when you extract those models out, you have something that says, okay, if we're going to create a rapid response team for education, we have one, the model of we need to create some kind of physical space because the gathering point is important, right? We have infrastructure that's been lost. And so how do we quickly create a type of pioneer tree that then creates a space that can be used as the hub for education? And then when we look at beavers, we say, okay, who are those that can bring on to teach while we rebuild? So we don't teach the regular curriculum in school because obviously the infrastructure is all down, but we render all of the children to be useful to the rebuilding efforts. And we create an educational system, a sort of training that helps, not necessarily maybe the workers like the ones that are rebuilding things that are dangerous, but maybe other models where they can come in and they can be almost apprentice-like, or they can learn by observation and being in the field. It's very simplified what I just said. I mean, but the point that I'm trying to say is that when you look at models that are from biology for social types of innovations, you have to look at the model. You have to take a step back and extrapolate the model. What I feel like this person is doing is bouncing back and forth between the biological and the abstract that they're trying to apply it to without going into enough detail of either one of them. I feel like you're going into almost too much detail. So if we look here, we were looking at, whereas an animal possesses specific sense organs, every plant cell is sensible. In other words, vegetal sensitivity is more distributed and open than animal sensitivity. Now the problem posed to our comprehension is how to reconcile flatness and sentience, or non-hierarchy and awareness. I feel like you're almost going too deep into the biology, and you need to kind of step out to talk about why is it that animals possess sense organs that are specific, and why instead does a plant have a distributed model? And there is a very big difference, as you know, because we've talked about this a billion times before, right? We talk about the fact that plants have to have that more distributed model because they're rooted. Right? So what does rootedness mean when you're looking at the city? Where does that rootedness fit in order to justify when you rely on your more distributed model of sensing versus when it's movement? And remember, we were talking about we don't want to demonize the chaotic, the movement, the action-based parts of a city. And in that particular case, those are the places where specific sense organs make sense because I am in movement, and therefore I need my different parts to do different things. I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but it just feels like there's too much going into certain things in some points without an explanation and an understanding of the macro models that have to coincide between the biology and the natural organism. This is something that it's not easy. I have to admit that as a biomimic, as somebody who has worked on several projects and has tried to look at what these distributed models look like in the social environment and really apply the stratum as he's talking about. It isn't easy. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying I feel like this is partly what's missing in what we're reading so far. So let's look at where are we? We passed through footnote number 10. Deleuze and Guattari philosophical, not biological notions of rhizo set out in contrast to the tree, provided an early attempt to de-emphasize hierarchy and to re-emphasize distributedness in not only plant life, but especially, as the French philosophers put it, the image of thought. And see, this is what I'm talking about. If you are going to talk about rhizomes versus trees, I feel like it's extremely important for you to explain, first of all, for the reader, why is a rhizome chosen, right? Why is it that Deleuze and Guattari talked about a rhizome, right? A rhizome, rather than a tree or any other kind of plant that has a different kind of biological perspective. That was just the wrong words that I used. A rhizome versus a tree that reproduces in a different way. A rhizome reproduces kind of almost clonally, right? I reproduce this rhizome and then I shoot up another, but it's all a big giant clone. Everything is the same, where a tree and its roots puts out, but the roots might have some shoots, but the shoots are not the same as, like, they're all part of that same. Oh, that was a bad description. Hold on. Rewinding. I'm trying to think of how to explain this. So, and a tree has reproductive through, seeds and other mechanisms. So therefore, I think it's important that if you're going to call this out, as he's calling out here, right, that he's talking about the fact that the notion of rhizomes set in contrast to the tree, you need to explain this. I feel like right now it's all kind of, you'll get it. And it's like, no, you need to get into it, because that's the whole meat of it. That's where this argument becomes really interesting. Okay, well, okay. Now the problem posed to our comprehension is how to reconcile flatness and sentience. Explain to me how flatness and sentience are two equal paradigms, like are two opposites. I'm not understanding. Or non-hierarchy and awareness. Again, what? Like, where are these two? Insofar as our usual understanding of awareness tends to place it hierarchically at the top of a pyramid composed by lower level biological circuits. Are you trying to say that hierarchy, because in animals we have specific sense organs, where in plants it's distributed and therefore the sentience is distributed? Because I'm not understanding this argument. So if you understood what he's trying to say, please let me know in the comments, because I'm not getting it. Over the last decade, plant biology has clarified that plants are more than mechanistic reflex complexes. Yes, in other words, saying plants are sentient, aware. Indeed, they are capable of orchestrating a multiplicity of stimuli into meaningful experience. As a consequence, plants are now seen as more animated than they were before. The very rise of an albeit controversial domain of plant neurobiology testifies this fact. Debates about plants' intelligence have interestingly helped to strike a new balance in the old duality evoked above between lively and numb plants. Numb? I really think he used a little too much Google Translate. I'm starting to, as a person who translates a lot of things from Italian to English, I can almost picture the Italian words he was thinking about, and therefore how he got, when he put it into Google Translate, he got numb, but it's, yeah. Yeah, no, numb is not the word. Yeah. It is now admitted that, not so differently from animals, plants learn by association, accumulate experience, and even have proprioception. Plants are also known to possess rhythms and memory, rhythms and okay. A bodily memory exempted from brain, yet capable of and storing information collected from environmental signals through processes such as histone methylation and histine acetylation and deacetylation. Acetylation, yeah, which implies self-modification of genetic materials. See, and here's a great example. You are having a conversation with people and you're making an argument that is a social, almost sociological, even maybe architect. He hasn't gotten into the architecture, but it's more of a sociological, anthropological kind of argument. And all of a sudden you're talking about biological processes. I don't think it's necessary because we don't say humans remember because there are specialized cells that are called so and so in the brain that do this, this, and this. We just don't do those types of things. So why are we doing it on the other side when it comes to plants? And this is a common mistake around these discussions, a common mistake that says the way I show you my social proof, my proof that I am qualified for doing this is to reduce the plant down to metabolic functions, to physiological functions, to mechanistic, while I'm having an argument that is saying plants are not mechanistic only. And this is where we get into confusion. Plants generate memory imprints from events they have experienced, both short-term through local concentration and deconcentration of proteins, and long-term. He hasn't said any of this about animals, by the way, or humans. It's just only about plants. And long-term through genetic modifications that are passed down to the next generation via seeds. The plant biologist Chamovitz, how is it? Chamovitz, Martyr, Galeano, Aristotle, although he didn't call him out by name, but he was talking about Guattari and Toulouse. Everybody's pulling from the same sources, which is really interesting, the fact that they are, and the fact that we've actually had many of these, we've reviewed so many of these papers already, has argued that there is awareness in plants because while not having a central nervous system, they do have the feeling of the elements surrounding them, the feeling of the elements surrounding them. In other words, they're aware of their environment as well as of the fields of forces they are inserted in. In other words, they have senses. Let me define this for you in case you're being confused by this. Plants are aware of their environment. They know what is around them. And they have extra senses that we don't have that help them understand to a greater degree their environment, such as pressure, gravity, and water, humidity levels, all kinds of different things that we don't conceptualize as humans. I'm still convinced we have all the ability to sense all these different things and that we could conceptualize them and make very specific, we can react to them, but we've just lost the ability to understand what we're feeling. That's my personal opinion. That comes from the fact that our plantness, for most of us, has been shut down or shut off. Plants, of course, feel the light, but they also perceive odor, touch, and gravity. In short, they have an immensely sophisticated sensory machinery. Plants are acutely aware of the world around them. They are aware of their visual environment. They differentiate between red, blue, far red, and UV lights, more than we do, and respond accordingly. They are aware of aromas surrounding them, chemicals, and respond to minute quantities of volatile compounds wafting in the air. Wafting. Plants know when they are being touched and can distinguish different touches. They are aware of gravity. They can change their shapes to ensure that shoots grow up and roots grow down. And plants are aware of their past. They remember past infections and the conditions they've weathered, and they then modify their current physiology based on these memories. And the funny part is that with all of that, Chamovitz still doesn't believe plants are intelligent. One day, I had an exchange. Did I ever tell you that I actually had an exchange with Chamovitz once via Facebook? That was interesting. That was very interesting. I was challenging him a bit. He was pretty good sport about it for a while. Then he was like, okay, I'm done. Chamovitz is very cautious in his argumentation. Yes, he is, and provides a wealth of scientific data and experiments in order to argue that plants do feel, but have no intelligence, insofar as they have no brain. Because you know how the neurobiologist, he's not a neurobiologist, he's a geneticist, but you know how the neurobiologists believe this? no brain, no intelligence. It's gonna be interesting when the scientists finally fully recognize that every kingdom or kinhome, as we call it, has probably developed their own intelligence in their own way. And when that all gets recognized and we can finally put an end to the idea that intelligence equals brain, and like finally it'll be great. I think we should be popping champagne. I am going to have a bottle on ice just for that. I'm going to have a bottle in the fridge that I'm going to keep for the day that it is internationally recognized, excuse me, that plants are intelligent. And we don't have to have this argument anymore. And I don't have to get Facebook comments from people telling me that they're not. I have a bunch of papers that tell you that they are. Indeed, it would be misleading to borrow the animal model of intelligence to plants. Yes, because animals are intelligent in one way and plants are intelligent in another. But we should also add that, besides the risk of confusing sensitivity with intelligence, that coming straight from Chamovitz. Because the idea that plants actually use all of that knowledge to make decisions also still doesn't count as intelligence. There is always the risk that attributing our own perceptual senses and attitudes to plants leads to incorrectly anthropomorphizing them. I am not anthropomorphizing just by calling them intelligent and by saying that they think. They think on their own, they make decisions on their own. That is not anthropomorphizing. Anthropomorphizing is the Disney movie I watched that had, a tree with a mouth that spoke and eyes, and the arms were the limbs, rather than letting the plant be a plant. That's all right. Such risk is, for instance, quite tangible in popularizing books such as Wallabens, which, while well-informed and written by a specialist forester, often indulges in characterizing lazy branches, fearful leaves, and clumsy trees. Okay, listen, buddy. If you're going to have this discussion, especially since it doesn't sound like an actual, like somebody who's in this argument really well, I am all for, and I am in agreement with you that Peter Wohlleben, in his books now, has anthropomorphized trees. But Wohlleben, similar to Simard, are very clear as to why they do this. This is an actual stylistic choice on their part. They choose these words very carefully, in particular Simard, which he's not talking about right now. We're just talking about Wohlleben, which again is a little bit too much for me too. But at a minimum, you should state that Wohlleben uses this anthropomorphic language because, given the current state of affairs where we are right now, in the connection we have with plants and in where we are with these he is not trying to make a scientific argument for the scientific world. So he is trying to make a connection to human beings that are disconnected from nature to say forests are not scary places. Forests are places that you can enjoy. Remember, he's a forester. And humans have a little bit too much Disney on this side too. The idea that the forest is scary, and a little bit too much Star Wars too. Every time you see a forest, it's menacing there. Again, other than it's the Ewok village, but everything else is menacing. So because they have to deal with this menacing attitude, he's anthropomorphized, and he uses these expressions in order to make it more easy, to make it easier, can't speak English, to relate to the plants, and therefore want to experience the plants and spend, and to reconnect. I'm not a big fan of the way that he does this, but I get his argument. And so at a minimum, state that that's the reason why he's doing it, right? And the fact that if you're going to state one side of the argument, which is the argument of plants not being intelligent, which I would think completely negate the rest of your argument if you went that path, but fine, that's a choice. If you're going to do it, then state that. Like, state it that you're choosing. If you've already talked about plant neurobiology, you know that there's another side of the argument you can choose. Based on my research and my experience and whatever, I'm choosing this camp. And that's fine. But you're kind of making it seem, and this is what I see in a lot of papers, so prepare for a very quick side rant. Many of the papers talk about this and this. They don't state there's two sides of an argument, And either I'm in one camp or another, but I recognize that there is two camps, and which is what we see in a lot of the discussion around plant sentience, right? But these people in the middle who are kind of coming in, who are not scholars of this material, I find talk about one camp as if that's the only camp, like as if that's the correct camp and that's the camp that everybody agrees with. And that this over here is this thing that comes up, but nobody agrees with that. And that's not true. There are two camps. They are still arguing. I just saw some papers come through from 2024 already that are still having some parts of the argument, but be more clear that you are coming into this and that you're seeing that there are two arguments. Both arguments have valid points. You're choosing to believe this one and you're basing your facts on this. By the way, I still think that that negates what you're trying to go for. That's my personal opinion, that what you're trying to go for. Anyway. Direct comparisons between humans and plants tend to generate several inconveniences. For instance, there is a fundamental difference in the way animals and plants perceive the light. The former do it with eyes, the latter without them. Okay, I want to see where he's going to go with this. Are we dealing in both cases with the same understanding of perception? In order to sidestep the dualism, the plants and us, which risks conjuring up the endless mirroring effects, a veritable mise en abîme, this paper suggests to triangulate the relationship via the city, understood as the very distinct sort of creature. This creature, it's another Italian things, by the way. Like they call everything una creatura, which is more of a being. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, this already tells me that he wrote this in an Italian perspective. The city may be endowed with life. However, it is clear that it is life per se, neither vegetal nor animal, nor, for that matter, fungal or mineral. Instead of analyzing plant life by comparing it to human animal physiological, psychological buildup, then projecting onto the plant our perceptual senses and fortiori our model of intelligence, it could be more interesting to attend the direct, although at first sight uncanny, plant-city connection. Tackling this connection, the perspective of growth becomes relevant. From a morphological view, Tom, I am holding back comment for 1 second because it seems like what he's trying to do for me feels opposite from what you're saying. Like you're telling me I'm not supposed to compare animal physiological and psychological buildup and then project it onto plants because you're trying to tell me that plants are not intelligent and that therefore they don't. But if you want me to have a vegetative stratum, then my vegetative stratum needs to think of plants as alive in order to have a series of properties in that stratum. So I'm very confused right now. I keep getting confused. From a morphological point of view, Tom remarked that the ramified form exhibited by plant development corresponds to a movement of expansion of the creature into its environment. From a morphological point of view, Tom remarked that the ramified form exhibited by plant development corresponds to a movement of expansion of the creature into its environment, which we may call radiation, up to an optimal deployment that is given by the plant's nutritive need. Okay, I need to read this footnote. Incidentally, it can be remarked that, describing such expansion of the vegetal into the environment, Tom seems to be thinking above all about angiosperms, trees. Whether his model holds for other types of plants remains ascertained. Remains to be ascertained. Okay. I don't understand what you're talking about by the movement of expansion in that way. I mean, is it? Oh, okay. Up to an optimal deployment, let's see. Since usually the plant feeds on light, and on surrounding dead organic matter, Tom contends that its form derived from an identification with the spatial extension of the nutritive environment. Okay, so I'm going to read just the English because it doesn't make sense to read the French. The vegetal must somehow identify itself to its nourishing milieu, and therefore to spatial extension. hence a ramified structure that, if the generativity of biological morphogenesis could unfold completely, would attain a fractal figure of Hausdorff dimension between 2 and 3. And self-similarly, that characterizes regular fractals plays an essential role in vegetable mortality. Yeah, I can tell that that's your translation. Such radiation, I'm still not sure what he's trying to say. Such radiation reminds us that the growth of plants is completely different from the growth of animals, insofar as the former is much less centered than animal life. Plants have been traditionally characterized as, I'm assuming he's meaning, as sessile, meaning that a plant can be pruned and reproduced by cutting. However, as everyone who's ever tried to perform pruning, cutting, or grafting knows, these are refined gardening techniques, far from being smooth and easy to enact. Because of the possibility of surviving cutting to a degree animals would not, the very boundaries of a single plant are called into question. Sorry, give me a second. Okay, we missed a footnote somewhere, but reading it, I'm not even going to get into it. 13. Animals can also survive amputation and sustain organ transplantation. As to the former, however, the amputability of animals is anatomically reduced vis-a-vis that of plants. This again testifies to the degree of centeredness of the individual animal is higher than that of the individual plant. As to the latter, it is quite interesting that the very terminology of this medical operation seeks a vegetal language. It may actually be the case that organ transplantation is effectuated upon the vegetative stratum of the animal rather than on its animated one. Okay, I'm not even going to touch that either. As a consequence, individuality in plants is different from individuality in animals. Yes, we already talked about this. At the same time, the plant is not completely acentric. Rather, it could be said to possess a complex centripetal zone, a kind of barycenter. Wow, there's a lot of Italian in this. Barycenter zone, where relations of centrality and peripherality can still be distributed. Concretely, if I cut the root badly in a way that destabilizes or creates a fatal disturbance to the barycenter zone, baricentro, which is the central zone, right? Like that point of equilibrium, the plant will probably not survive. The fact that the cut is in any case always a shock to the plant, not an anodyne event to go through, suggests that a form of individuality is in fact present in it. Perhaps the mathematical model of the potential well could be employed to describe the field of differential distributions in formation of individuality across different domains, highlighting how a different breadth of equipotentiality contradistinguishes, again, more Italianized words, minerals, fungi, plants, and animals. In mathematical physics, number 14, in mathematical physics, a potential well is defined as the region that surrounds a local minimum of potential energy. A potential well determines a region where the law of entropy is suspended and energy can be accumulated, given that no energy can escape the region until the local maximum is surmounted. The model is applied by Thom in his semiophysics, but is also widely used in quantum mechanics. In the context of our discussion, it may indicate the degree to which individual creature exists in a condensed or diffuse state. A connection may be established with Schrodinger's idea that living organisms thrive on suckling orderliness from their environment, by which action, a taming of increasing entropy could be locally achieved. Okay. I'm still not getting where he's going with this. If you can figure it out, please, please, please let me know, because I've already gotten lost. I have to admit, I've gotten lost. Without venturing into detailed formal models, suffice it to say here that the sessile nature of the plant corresponds to a different mode, or at least a different degree of individuation. In plants, the limits of the individual are less sharply drawn than in the end of animal. Yes, and the problem of individuality can be approached from different perspectives. Okay, Tell me where the problem is. With the heuristic aim to defamiliarize from us remember, we're talking about the vegetative city. This is the problem I'm having, is that I'm not tying this back to the city perspective. But maybe he is going to wrap it up in a nice bow, and I'm just impatient. With the heuristic aim to defamiliarize from the usual preconceptions about plants and animals. One way to do so could be, for instance, to hypothesize that the vegetative stratum is one of non-individual nature, difference of kind, but that each living entity appropriates it in different ways, difference of degrees. The encounter between the stratum and the entity then determines a measure of being. So is the stratum a physicality, or is the stratum a state of being? I am still super confused about this. The encounter between the stratum and the entity then determines a measure of being, and the question may turn into singling out the measure that is inherent in plant life as a whole, and, as we shall see, how such measure reframes a city. We know, for instance, that plant clonal colonies, only some of which are encountered via root systems, can grow much older than individual trees. The famous Pando group of quake and aspen, located in south central Utah, dates back to 80,000 years and is the heaviest known living organism, weighing, according to estimates, about 6,000 tons. Clearly, I'm not reading the footnote because it's just a Wikimedia reference. Clearly, an organism such as Pando deeply challenges commonsensical notions of individuality. One cannot see the whole of Pando, only some of its manifestations, lest embrace its temporal span of growth. Pando is an organism, but also a whole forest, a whole population. It is, in fact, a multiplicity in Duluth's and Guattari's sense. An extreme case of individuality, Pando suggests that even a tree can, in fact, be a rhizome. Even a single tree appears here to form an ensemble of connectors, a colony, a population. In space, just as in time, Pando exceeds the measure of the individual. Biologists have suggested that Pando is dying. However, its death will probably span hundreds or even thousands. Yes, but explain why Pando is dying. Pando could live on forever because Pando, key, is clonal. Pando is dying because new shoots are not able to grow. And therefore, that death might span hundreds or even thousands of years, depending on how many shoots are able to manifest. How many new shoots, which become individual trees from the way that we look at the quaking aspen, but how many new shoots are able to come up will expand on that death. Therefore, death is not because Pando is sick or anything is holding Pan back. It is the environmental factors themselves that are creating the conditions. Too many deer, not enough wolves, too many deer eating Pando. This is an excellent point to be making in the city, right? Where you have certain things that could live on forever, but then when the environment destabilizes, that piece of the environment starts to die off. This would be a great example. I'm not exactly sure which example you're trying to make, which is the fact that, yeah, Pando's probably is dying, but Pando is not dying from natural causes. It's an artifact of a problem introduced by humans, which is similar to what happens in urban spaces. Many of the things that die off are actually because of environmental factors, of relationships not being recognized. So this is a great example of the vegetative stratum that could really help that argument. I'm not still not understanding where he's going with this. Under these circumstances, does it make any difference to say that it is living instead of dying? Yes, it makes a difference. The notion of multiplicity enables the setting of plants in movements in space and time. Philosophers have traditionally defined the plant on the basis of its rootedness, of its sessile nature. For this reason, the plant has been associated with a sense of stability and safety, staying put. The plant is said to be sessile, fixed in one place. In fact, however, plants are much more adventurous than just rooted, localized creatures. No, they are rooted, localized creatures that happen to also be adventurous. A first-rank connoisseur such as the gardener Clement has dubbed plants the great vagabonds, for the plant includes not only the part of it that is present before our eyes, its trunks, branches, and roots, but also its seeds, which travel with the wind at great distance. The air of the globe is thick with such traveling seeds and spores. Consequently, the notion of individuality comes to be very much relativized, by the fact that the entity itself exists in diffuse state or dispersive cloud. But that's not the entity itself, right? In the moment that you have a seed, you will now have a new entity. Your individuality comment from the perspective of biologically speaking is great. I had talked about it earlier, right? And when you look around at your houseplants, how many of them are plants that you've maybe even divided or separated in some way and created two, and then therefore we have one. Like, when we look at no name Dracaena over here, no name Dracaena was once all one big plant, and now no name Dracaena is two different plants, but yet there is an entity that is shared between these two plants. That's a different thing than a seed. Animals' seeds do not travel even a fraction of the vegetal distance, which creates a completely different geometry of association. For instance, in terms of mating and reproductive, but also more generally in terms of the definition of what counts as a social encounter and where the boundaries of individuals in interaction can be drawn. The notion of multiplicity crafted by Deleuze and Guattari is aimed at tackling similar spatio-temporal spans. The life of Pando seems exceptional, yet only insofar as we rely on a commonsensical understanding of animal individuality. In other words, we are biased towards attaching importance to a certain type of individuality, and especially so when the animal is human. But populations, generations, and species may be similarly regarded as individual entities. For instance, when paleontologists reconstruct the encounter between two civilizations, or when historians document the dynamics of a revolutionary change, or when ecologists model the impact of the human species on other species present in a given niche, individuality must change nature. In fact, no animal exists aside from a population of which it is a specimen. From this perspective, except for even when you're talking about the difference between animals and humans, there is a big difference because humans have stayed pretty much Homo sapiens for as long as we can remember. Okay. Yes. If you're a paleontologist, you know more, but that's not my point. I'm talking about the regular person. Instead, when we're talking about animals, there is evolutionary shifts within our own visible sphere where a species we discover has already evolved into a new species. So where does the individualization happen, right? At what point does that new species appear? We normally do not recognize the in-between stages. We recognize the different points. And so I'm still not understanding. I'm really hoping he's going to tie this back to the city. Only by looking at animal populations, and ultimately species are a manifestation of populations, can we see animal seeds traveling the continents and colonizing new lands as plants do. We may also, especially the ant, colonize the entire freaking world. We may also say that the vegetative stratum radiates through animal existence as the enhancement of dispersion, distribution, and growth. Why? What does that even mean? The relative lack of coordination that contradistinguishes the plant corresponds quite neatly. What lack of coordination? Quite neatly to what Nietzsche once called generating much misunderstanding, the will to power. From a Nietzschean perspective, if there are living beings endowed with will to power, these are the plants and perhaps the fungi, certainly not the animals in the first place. If there are living beings endowed with will to power, these are the plants and perhaps the fungi, certainly not the animals in the first place. The reason is that Nietzsche locates the essence of power in the lack of organization. It's looseness instead of tightness. A soft connection between the parts enables the type of flexibility and multiplicity of equilibria that a strong connection destroys because of its rigid encasement. Let's look at footnote 16. Max Weber, subsequent image of the iron cage of rationality can be understood as a negative illustration of the same principle. Okay. For Nietzsche, power lies in an openness to life, which plant life embodies best. This is why he writes that humans still have to learn from flowers how to bloom. Compared to the restlessness and the dissatisfaction of the animal, vegetal existence teaches the priority and primacy of patiency over agency. Okay, patiency, yes, over agency, no. Just because I'm patient doesn't mean I don't exercise agency. He makes some really un- unexpected assumptions of the capacity to feel over the capacity to act. Vegetative states are characterized by an intensity of feeling, by a pathos that signifies openness to the environment. Didn't before you side with Chamovitz that plants don't necessarily or are you talking about feelings here in the very biological perspective? And that plants don't have a capacity to act? I am so confused. This diffusiveness is perhaps epitomized by blossoming, but by no means confined to it. In fact, as the plant projects itself into the environment, it develops and entertains a special relation with the four Aristotelian essences. Always going back to frickin' Aristotle. The plant is earth that projects itself into the air, and its life spans a minimum threshold defined by water. Without water, the plant dries and dies, and a maximum threshold defined by fire. Burning is the final destruction of the plant cut down into wood. How do we get there? Because how do we get to the fire part? Okay. I'm going to center myself. In conclusion, it is advisable to admit that the connection between plants and animals is not a linear one. On the one hand, vegetation seems turned in the first place towards bacteria and insects. What? Rather than towards vertebrate animals with humans among them. On the other hand, plants are also permanently turned towards the weather. What? A complex geometry of encounter ensues so that through the plant, animals similar to us can enter a threshold zone where the horizon of animality is intimately infused in climatic conditions. It is just simply not fruitful to oppose plants and animals or plants and minerals. Instead, what could be more helpful is to examine how vegetative stratum characterized by growth through dispersive connection seems to infuse plant and animal life, as well as perhaps even in ways that are still hypothetical at the moment, fungal, bacterial, and mineral life. Okay, hold on a second. I'm so curious as to how much we have to go. So that's 2 pages. Where are we? Wow, this paper is going a lot longer. It's a lot longer than I expected. Okay, so 16 is the last page of it. Ooh, unfortunately, in the mode that I have, hold on, let's see if I can exit this mode. Menu, view. Why? View. Okay. See if this it doesn't. It doesn't give me the opportunity to go back to where I was. Where were we, folks? Because I'm getting so lost in this. I feel like, oh, here we are. Okay, so we are on page 10, and we have till page, this is going to be weird to see. Read mode. Okay. Oh, okay, that's why. You just got me into the wrong mode. Is anybody else getting as confused as I am? Because I'm finding this to be way not what I was expecting. Like, all right, I'm going to try to read through it because I feel like if I keep stopping to comment, we're going to be here 700 hours. Vegetal temporarily, vegetative hopes. Because you know what it is? I cannot figure out, and maybe this is the part. Look, I just said I was going to stop doing this, but I am not. I cannot figure out if he's talking, again, physically or abstractly. Is he talking about it from from a model perspective, I'm so confused. So confused. Okay. As suggested above, the vegetative stratum may be approached as not only a spatial topology, but also a temporal register and temporal horizon. Plants are the most long-lived life forms. There is some proof of some Pinus longeva specimen of several thousands of years of age. I'm assuming that this is just a simple, old Chico who's about 10,000 years old. Yet, it is not the sheer extension of a life that matters, rather, the qualitative character of vegetal temporarily. And gross, as a first approximation, the vegetal appears as a slow as opposed to the quickness of the animal existence. In few minutes, a human equipped with a chainsaw can cut a tree that employed decades to grow to that size. I'm going to keep going. Thus, there seems to be an indelible disproportion between these two kingdoms of life. It may well be that, from the point of view of plants, animals, and among them humans, look like frantic, accelerated creatures with neurons firing like crazy. Plants and animals have made two evolutionary choices based on irreconcilable compositions of speed. If you stare at a plant and try to see it grow, you can't see it. Better, you can't see it grow even in the process of actually looking at it growing before your eyes. Where is that from? Incidentally, this is an illustration of the fact that the perspectively visible and invisible are not opposed to each other, but rather coexist and somehow feed into one another. Okay, I'm not even going to get there. In practice, it is only through specialized technological visualization techniques seen, such as time lapse and high rate filming, technologies that enable humans to change their perceptual latitudes, dislocating rhythm and magnitude of perception, that we can see plants grow. If at birth we are not made for this type of perception, it is perhaps because animal life added onto the vegetative stratum a different enterprise, endowed with a different temporality and a different topology, and chose to invent onto that distinct form of life. Perhaps animation might not even be even properly described as a stratum. I don't know, but should be better theorized through its moments of being. At some point during evolution, the kingdoms were parted, and there are also always the involutive movements that reopen the conversation. The vegetal has, in many cases, been imagined as possessing a temporality that revolves or pivots around a rhythmic cosmic pattern. For instance, in his joint work with Irigaray, oh my God, I hate saying that name. Every time we come up to Irigaray, I'm like, Martyr has highlighted the seasonal weighting that characterizes plants, especially in the agricultural encounter with plants. At the origin of the seasons, then, planetary time is measured by stages of plant life and of human dealing with plants. There is an appropriate time for entrusting the seed to the earth, the season of sowing, which came to be a synecdoche for all the other seasons. Vegetative time is integrally a seasonal time. And in fact, seasons are named after the events that contradistinguish. I hate the fact that he uses contradistinguish. That just distinguish the life of plants, because contradistinguish is often used in Italian. For instance, the Italian word for winter, inverno, literally means the lack of spring, which in turn is the sprouting of vegetation. I'm sure that from the perspective of probably the Latin, I didn't know that, because spring is called primavera. Ah, vera. I get it. Primavera. Okay. So it's the lack of spring or the lack of summer? Anyway, which in turn is the sprouting of a vegetation. While in Spanish, the summer is verano. See, that's why I'm saying the lack of spring, which is the fully vegetative season, inverno, and verano. That makes sense to me, but why are you talking about lack of spring, or is it the lack of summer? Ver. I think you made a mistake there, because primavera is before ver. Primavera, before ver, which is spring. So it's before summer. So I think he meant to say it means a lack of summer, which is the fully vegetative season. The time of seasons is the opposite of the time of logistics, a non-logistical time that is also the time of art. Art understood as precisely a natural production. Oh, I'm not going to go there. The idea that the plant is slow is somehow reassuring, but is it correct? The impression of the vegetal being as a being of slownessness, I can't use creature there, may need to be reviewed. In practice, everyone who owns a garden remains always surprised by how fast the grass and the plants are found suddenly overgrown. They have not simply grown fast, they have, in a sense, already overgrown, grown before we could cast our gaze upon them, grown in the invisible. Like a like a sumo fighter, the plant moves in the in-between in a kind of smooth, like a sumo fighter? How do you get to a sumo fighter in this? The plant moves in the in-between in a kind of smooth, safe. Okay, I think I need to make myself a little bit bigger because you have to see my expressions, which are like, what? How do we get to a sumo fighter? The plant moves in the in-between in a kind of smooth space that sidesteps measures. The wonderful high-speed photography capable of revealing to us the fluid sprout of a bud is essentially a technical device to dislocate our animal temporality and put us in touch with the vegetal horizon of time. Unfortunately, it's also a trick that may end up hiding more than revealing. For the vegetable time is not slow, but aeonic, akin to what Spinoza once called eternity, a mundane eternity every one of us can experience through one's own mode of existence. Footnote 19. An elaboration concerning the difference between three types of Deleuzian temporalities, aeonic, chronic, and chronological, is provided in another paper. 19. While animals and plants appear as a mostly out of sync with each other, the profane illumination. How can you say that? Animals and plants don't appear out of sync with one another. Humans and plants appear out of sync with one another. Oh my goodness, this paper. I don't know if I'm going to make it through, folks. I don't know if I'm going to make it through. With each other, the profane illumination of vegetative temporality lies in generating the notion of right time. Of course, as one reviewer has acutely noticed, the notion of right time may be suspected of reintroducing a form of Silvo-Agrarian nostalgia, which we talked about at the very beginning of this paper. Well, not the very beginning, but like near the beginning. As hinted above, the Silvo-Agrarian movement is probably unavoidable. The point is not to renounce universals, but to reject universals that are imposed upon life instead of being generated by it. Okay. The right time is the endogenous production of the vegetative stratum. In this sense, Clement underlines that. For reasons related to seasons, to the rhythms of flows inside plant organism, to the energetic impact of the sun, to the abundance or scarcity of water, vegetals take their time. They only determine themselves to develop once all the necessary circumstances are reunited. To try to accelerate the process would just lead them to grow under life-threatening conditions. So they wait for the moment, the good moment. No time, credit, no debit. To them, time is never an object of speculation. Either it is right or it is not. That's Even if it's incredible accelerations, it being already overgrown, and decelerations, the seed. This is a perception perspective. Like you are talking about it as if it's the plants, but it's not the plants. This is. The plant is always on time. The plant, Clement suggests, cannot but happen at the right time. Whilst the animal often hurries up, the plant secretes its own sovereign course. Of course, that does not mean that the plant is not exposed to the sudden changes in weather and climate that represent adverse events to it. Vegetative timing is in between time, simultaneously time that prepares and sustains the rhythms of life as it proceeds through the becoming of weather. Isn't all timing? It is thanks to the plants that animals, with humans among them, got to know that there is a right time, a mature time, an opposite time, the fruitful time. It is important to clarify the nature of such fruitfulness. Because of its low degree of visibility, the vegetative stratum may be easily misunderstood for an infrastructural level of sort, which is not. The plant neither supports action nor acts in the sense that it does not operate in the register of making things. Certainly, the plant is productive and also extremely productive in terms of bringing forward flowers and fruits, but it is not in the sense of an industrious production. Why? In many cases, production is overabundant. For instance, the production of fruits in a plant is generous, for only a minute fraction of seeds will end up in a situation that is favorable to the germination. For fruits and seeds are not functions, rather, ways of deployment of the plant's own existence. Expressions, not products. Only through a series of chemical tricks used in industrial agriculture and genetic engineering are plants spurred not simply to produce more, but turned into production oriented machines. Left to itself, the plant may be productive or overproductive, yet without solely orient. How can you say or overproductive when left to themselves? You don't know all the motivations that the plant is using for the production, in this case, production of seeds. Yes, some seeds are for the continuation of life. Also, seeds are to nourish the environment because many of those seeds are eaten by other types of life or they're used by other species in other ways. Therefore, there are multiple uses to the seeds, and therefore the plants might not be overproducing, but producing just the right amount in order to ensure adequately nourishing the soil, nourishing all the species that are around, ensuring then the germination of the plants. So, in other words, the next generation of the plants. Like, there are a lot of like things here that are taken and inserted that I wish would be more clear, that this is my conclusion is this, and therefore this is my derivative interpretation based on this, rather than just saying this is the way it is. Uh, the plant does not seem obsessed by production as animals are, because there's different. Because there's different mechanisms of reproduction in this case. And even for certain plants, there's very big differences here. There's big swaths here that's really frustrating me. I'm probably already frustrated now, so everything I'm seeing is just frustrating me even more. Cultivation has been for millennia the way humans have encountered plants, at least since the creation of the garden evoked by Clement. Culture itself is, quite literally, cultivation. In a famous definition of culture, Simmel wrote that culture entails bringing something beyond that would come effortlessly from it. It is a form of intensification and overcoming. Culture is originally a relation to the animal with the plant, aimed to make plants more productive. Agriculture, the use of props, stakes, clips, grafts. Now he's moved into gardening and agriculture. And I am frustrated because I feel like he's just jumping from thing to thing to thing, and he's never tying it back to what he means by city. So now it seems like we're not talking about city in the perspective of urban cities like we were before. Now we're into a rural world. I am very confused. Please, again, if you are able to make heads or tails of what this author is trying to depict, I am all for it. But I am going to jump ahead a little bit because I'm getting very frustrated by this. For the rest, nature itself is thoroughly experimental. This I can agree with. What the plant is oriented towards remains linked to an understanding of its rhythms, of its season, rather than subsumed under a single overall project. True, because we don't understand the way that the plant thinks, and therefore we don't understand. In particular, there seems to be a special affinity between the vegetative stratum and the state of hopefulness. Again, which should be wary of projecting human passions, such as joy, rage, envy, onto plants. And also hopefulness, because isn't that a human emotion? Hopefulness, however, points towards a relatively well-defined state that alludes to seasonal becoming and transformation, including the sense of concentration, waiting, preparation, and utopian promise, the seed. No, let's not make any generalizations that are anthropomorphic, but let's make these assumptions. This is probably still an anthropomorphic reading. Yes, it is. Yet arguably to a minimalistic one. I'd like to hear that argument because we must approach the issue by recognizing that vegetable existence is indifferent to many of our feelings. Again, we have no way of knowing this. And certainly indifferent to despair. And I would say that some of your houseplants might disagree with this. They can tell when you're stressed. Kin can tell. In a sense, vegetation is always hopeful because it does not know the abrupt interruption of life encountered by animals. What? How does it not know? Okay, because, plants have never been cut down by a chainsaw example that you used earlier. If it is already difficult enough to say when an animal is dead, when it has finished dying, for plants, it is many cases impossible. Okay, I'll agree with this. That is true. That is true. That part is true. That's true. The cypress legendarily planted by St. Francis of Assisi in the 1200s and that nowadays occupies a large share of its cloister of the monastery of Santa Croce in Villa Verrucchio, Italy, is perhaps already part dead in many parts, but some other parts of it continue to live and grow. Less and more than an individual, that tree has lost the shape of cypress and has become a whole environment. It does not possess a single source of life, or an individuality, but rather appears as a hyper creature, a cluster of living lines and waves that continue to cross over a continent of dead biomes. Wait, why? Why does it continue to cross over a continent of dead biomass? I don't understand the continent part there. Sorry. It is not surprising, after all, that humans and cities need plants to remain hopeful. For instance, traveling Japan during the Hanami, the traditional flowering viewing festival of the cherry blossom, sakura season, a foreigner observer cannot fail to notice how people are not simply constantly turned toward flowers, walking with their nose upward and snapping amounts of pictures of them. During the Hanami celebration period, it has been observed Japanese people enter into a kind of inebriated flying state. One could argue that it is also connected to a sense of fulfillment or completion, which may be in part true. However, it should also be remembered that Japanese cherries breeds are fruitless and are selected specifically for their majestic yet fragile and transient flowering. Blossoms last no more than a couple of weeks. This seems to resonate with the specifically elegant Japanese mindset, which would find it gross enough to see the flowers as functional to the fruit. In fact, as reconstructed by the anthropologist Anuki Tierney, the symbol of the cherry blossom was heavily exploited by Japanese nationalism to encourage personal sacrifices for the country. The cherry blossom was the flower of election of kamikaze soldiers. In today's Japan, at least, what it seems to count is not only a single blossoming of a single tree, but the coming of a blossoming wave throughout the country from the south to the north, which is daily announced by weather agencies and broadcast by radio and TV networks. The people strolling in the street from the Hanami outdoor parties appear to join such vegetal hopefulness and prolong it into themselves, into their own way of being, as explained, for instance, by Sarufumi Ukiyama, the curator of the Portland Japanese Garden. The Japanese celebration is supposed to take place just before full blossoming, the moment before the best. That is, in a time of intense anticipation and hopefulness. The Hanami, in this sense, provides one of the clearest examples of how the arrival of a new season is akin to an act of conversation, a metanoia that marks the acceptance of the vegetative rhythms of a growing coming incorporated into the animal, as well as perhaps the recognition paid by the city to its own polymorphic stratigraphy of states and moments. Okay, we're getting back into the city, folks. We're getting back into the city. Hopefully, we don't have much longer. Urban setting is, hold on, speaking of not getting much longer, I need to check on something. Oh, okay. Sorry, I was supposed to finish at 7, but it doesn't look like I'm going to finish. Lasagna. Okay, I'm checking in on my friend because, now it's like, okay. There we go. Moving. Urban space is partitioned into heterogeneous territories where the vegetative strata may be conveyed in various ways and to different extents. The vegetative city may thus be imagined as a formation that unfolds in between other strata of the city, between the various layers of existence, as well as between its various degrees of sentiency, capacity to feel, to remain open to the environments. Thus, the vegetative mode amounts to a peculiar form of expression of the city. More particularly, vegetative states tend to appear dreamlike. They present themselves as eccentric instead of egocentric, and impersonal instead of experiential. Why are they not experiential? The city knows such dreams, decentered or diffuse dream states, which urban narrators of the like of Don DeLillo and Paul Auster, but also photographers, whatever, have managed to feel and make us feel. The vegetative stratum is perhaps better understood by art rather than theory. Yet it is perhaps possible also for social, spatial, and cultural theory to encounter vegetativeness as a prism for understanding the urban process. The vegetative stratum speaks of a city that occurs only and just when the time is right, contrary to the mineral and mechanic and the animal city. The vegetative city is marked by its discrete ramified growth and brainless sentience, its aeonic and eternal temporality. The vegetative city thrives in between the animated city, the former constantly filling the interstices of the latter. Such interstitial nature was perhaps originally an infrastructural one. Plants have, in many cases, traditionally provided the raw materials to build cities, even down to their foundations. The case of Venice might be interesting here. Venice, usually regarded as a maritime empire, however, its vegetative stratum was heavily tributary to the forest in the Alps and the karst plateau from where the wooden piles upon which the city is erected came. More generally, if we look at the city as a built environment, then it may become helpful to observe that, as Gruber has pointed out, both architecture and plants constantly deliver space for other organisms, and actually more than space, time spaces. The garden, for instance, can be seen as a space of election for a suspension of the overlaid temporal strata that usually hide the vegetative mode. What the garden offers is a clearing of time. It may well be that humans have created gardens to explicit their own vegetation. Thanks to Clement, we have learned to enlarge the notion of garden. Unplanned or unabundant spaces, places in standby, such as vacant lots, urban interstices, terrain vague, which we already talked about in the paper on unintentional landscapes, they're wild gardens. To speak with Clement, garden in movement. How do we go from garden and like cultivating your vegetation to wild spaces? I feel like he still jumps from one thing to the other. Wild gardens are scattered bits and pieces of a larger unitary planetary garden, such as undecided landscapes are for Clement. The embodiment of spatial freedom and vitality in these places. There is nothing that has to do with death. I can't unpack that now. It's too much. If the garden is practically everywhere in the city, as well as on planet Earth, then it's just a matter of locating the stratum where the consistency of vegetative growth and rhythms can be perceived more clearly. Maybe even stealing concrete structures possess one such stratum. Actually, certain buildings appear to not only exist, but also vegetate. It is not the case of turning to contemporary architecture exploits. Okay, I'm jumping. Sorry, folks. Like, this is really, now we're getting into contaminated soils, overgrown weeds, rusty fragments of unknown or old-fashioned production devices from typical. Now we're getting into, he just goes into everything. And now we're talking about weeds, or what he called bad herbs, which is basically wild plants, phytoremediation. There's just so much here that I feel like I'm already so lost and frustrated with it that I want to get to the conclusion, which is let's get to the very, very end conclusion, because I think that there's too much. Too much. We've been going for 2 hours. I feel like there's a stop point. In conclusion, the vegetative mode of existence, or what has been termed here the vegetative stratum, is not focused on scheduled activities or projected achievements. In this sense, the vegetative city is distinct from the industrial and the industrious city. If ever, it is what remains when the former retreats, cracks up, or falls apart. The vegetative stratum takes place when the time is ripe. It introduces us to sentient city without a central nervous system. It is a city that does not act. You really need to read more papers, because yet lives and feels. A city that is sentient and responsive to its environment, therefore it acts. How can you say it doesn't act? And the events that happen in it, although not productive of actions itself. What are we talking about? How can we say this? Plants are the vegetative stratum is that which produces the environment in which additional action can take place. Therefore, of course, it acts. A city that develops through its environment. It is the environment, unfolding and co-volving in homeostasis with it. How can it co-evolve if it doesn't act? The city breathes, blossoms, takes roots, releases seeds, all actions. The vegetative stratum is the anarchic city, a silent city that passes unremarked for the most part. Unremarked? Sure, I'm going to give you that one. Sometimes belittled as numb and uninteresting. I'm trying to remember what word he's thinking when he translated to numb, because I remember having this conversation with somebody. It's a great word and it's not numb. It means something else. Oh, why can't I think of it? It'll come to me at some point. And still a vital city that brings rhythms into effect, crosses winters snowed under, looks for the new sun to come. The vegetative stratum embodies a life that, regardless of all the rest, which, please note, is no small thing, makes its course. Okay, the positive, we did not see the word ontological or epistemological in any of this. Look, I think that there is there is a budding piece of something that could be extremely interesting in this paper. Really, I do. I think a few things happen. One, translation. I feel like there is way too much Italian being kind of almost literally translated into English. This is my personal opinion. I could be completely wrong, but it's how it feels to me as a person that does this on a regular basis. Two, way too many variables that are often in contradiction to one another. And therefore, not a, I think he just bit off more than he could chew. This is my personal opinion. I could be completely wrong, but this is the way that I am experiencing this paper. I experience this paper as just too much, too much, too much, and too many, in my opinion, assumptions that don't need to be there. Too many assumptions that literally, in my opinion, don't need to be there. So that's it. That's where I am with The Vegetative City by Andrea Mubi Brighenti. I think it's a valiant effort. I applaud your effort. But I feel like it's too much. There's too many assumptions. There's not a clear understanding of if you're talking about biological or like other kinds of more patterns. I feel, yeah, too much, too much. But I want to hear from you. What do you think it is? Like, is this something that, how do you see this? I mean, please leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts because I'm super curious. Or you can join us in the Naturally Conscious community to have this conversation because it is, I think that there's an embryonic piece here that's super important. I'd also love to answer any kind of questions that come up or like let's experience, like, yeah, I think we need to have a deeper conversation about this. I feel like it's just missing a common thread. I think it's just let me throw a lot of stuff at it. And yeah, I don't love it. I don't love it. I don't love it. So, I don't know what your thoughts were. I'd love to hear it. Please, you can send me a message. You can write a comment. You can join us in the Naturally Conscious community again. I am super happy to continue this conversation. This was The Vegetative City by Andrea Mubi Brighenti. I will, of course, when I post the replay, post all the show notes, post also the citation so you can go off and read the paper on your own. And hopefully you'll maybe get more out of it than I did because I am still walking away from this confused. Also because he states in the very opening, this is my 10-second rant again, that he doesn't have an actual, like, this isn't a conclusive argument. This is more of something it's an elaboration. It's what he's processing, what he's thinking about, what he's brainstorming, what he's looking at it. What did he do? He made it all into this is the way it is. That just seems incoherent. Anyway, I will look forward to hearing from you and we will see each other next week for another edition of Plant Consciousness Commentary. Until then, remember, Resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. This is me, Tigria Gardenia, and we will see each other soon. Bye.